Good evening. I would like to call this school board work session to order. The date is September 30th, 2024, and the time is now 7:04. The school board would like to take a moment to respectfully acknowledge that we reside in the traditional land of the Dene people. Our mission is to provide an excellent and equitable education in a safe, supportive environment so that all students will succeed and contribute to a diverse and changing society. Ms. Richardson, could you call the roll?
Mr. Burgess,
Here.
Mrs. Burnett,
Here.
Mr. Doran,
Here.
Miss Maple,
Here.
Miss Marati is excused, Mrs. Sanderson is excused, Mrs. Hardy.
Here.
Thank you.
That brings us to our policy work. Ms. Diana Dillard, our student policy and discipline our specialist, along with Dr. Meinert, will continue the work on Article 3, business non-instructional operations, to get ready for the transfer over to the ASB board platform.
All right. Thank you, President Hardy. We're going to skip ahead to policy 3513.3, which is on page 29 of the packet. Mr. DeGraw was unexpectedly called away today, and so he won't be at tonight's meeting. And so we're going to try to start with that policy and go towards the end. And then if we still have time and we want to get into more of the business office or operational specific policies, we can. But we also know that this is a big chapter and not sure how far we'll make it through, and also want to recognize that Andy's not here to be able to answer really specific questions if folks have them. If we do get into those policies, happy to answer as many questions as we can here, and if there's things that we need to take back and bring back to the board, we can certainly do that at that time. But that's why we wanted to start mid chapter tonight. Yeah, I think it's page 29.
29, it should be tobacco.
3,000
Oh, start at 3,000?
or come back, make sure we come back to it.
Oh yeah, we'd come back to them all for sure.
So
Go ahead.
the idea was we didn't want to cancel, especially since we were making the collaborative conversations. Felt like that way, if people weren't able to come, although I felt like that was really productive, we would still have this to do, but knowing that Mr. Grawl is the expert in this area. So if we do more of the end of the chapter, we will do the next beginning of the chapter in another work session. It's a very long chapter, and we also are trying to keep it to around an hour tonight so that everybody can go home, get a good night's rest, because we have even more work tomorrow. I think she's working on the airtime. It's this 400s, I see the 3,000.
Yeah.
We're ready. Is there anything on this first policy? Mr. Doran.
Okay. And maybe if you could make it just a little bit larger, would be helpful. In the first paragraph, third line, halfway through, it says in parentheses, where appropriate in, in regard to disciplinary measures. Well, actually, I guess in regard to all of them, but anyway, question whether it should be as appropriate or when appropriate. So you're aware.
you have a preference for which one you'd like to change
I
it to?
don't really have a preference. I went with, I said as first, and then I thought, well, maybe it's when, but either one works. So,
Everyone's in agreement?
Down in number 2, just a typo, snuff, it's a double F. Towards the end of the second line. And I was, it's on this next page, after number 4 is done. It seems like really there should be a subheading, because we switched from being tobacco-free schools to alcohol and drug-free schools. And And then this comes up in, oh, let me, does that make?
Yeah.
I think if people have a thing, raise your hand.
And then the cross-references, are they there just as we're going through this process and will not be inserted in the final product?
The cross-references will be, and there'll be links. So you'll be able to click on the links for the cross-references. Now, if they're not, if those policies are not online yet, then they won't be links and they won't be put in. But as soon as those policies come online, then there'll be links to those policies.
Then my suggestion is that all those CFs be at the bottom, because there's several places in other policies in the total packet where they're interrupting, so you don't get a clean flow of the language. But I think those CFs are important, but I think all our references should be at the bottom. So we have the policy and then it's.
I would only add that sometimes it's, as the policy flows, it might be like, it's telling you the cross-reference right at that moment because it pertains to that paragraph. So that's why it's designed that way, but I think if we want to put them at the end, that's fine too.
Right, I'm just putting out there, I think in flow of reading, and there's other spots not here where it's the same cross-reference mentioned several times in the course of the policy, so but we're not that far away. That's why I'm thinking if all the references are together at the end, it's an easier jump up, but anyway, that was my reading thought.
That might be a good philosophical conversation for the board to have currently and provide direction to the administration if there's strong feelings one way or the other. I think what Mr. Doran is referencing is what we've historically done in Fairbanks, having cross-references either at the top or the bottom, not intermixed within the policy, but AASB does tend to put cross-references within the policy itself. So some good direction from the board around this would be helpful.
Mr. Burgess.
I do agree that it causes a little bit of awkwardness in the reading. However, I think it can be useful to have references near to the wording that they apply to. I wonder if there's a different way that we can do that to kind of get the best of both worlds. For example, using a superscript numbering system where, so you can just put a superscript 1 next to the sentence that applies to a certain cross reference. And if it comes up multiple times, you can just use that superscript 1 again and have everything at the bottom, just like you do footnotes, basically. Is that, what do others think?
Was there a hand I missed? I had a question following up on what Mr. Burgess just said. As far as your work and the fact that we've already approved some of these without something like that, does that add a lot of work to your plate if the board were to want something like that?
It would be easy enough to edit.
I feel like the superscript across the policy manual could get pretty intense if it were policy by policy. I mean, that definitely makes sense and I kind of like that direction, putting a number, and then that would just correspond to the cross-reference down below that individual policy. But I'd be worried about it carrying through the policy manual.
My intent was to have it within each policy.
Okay, yeah.
And maybe keeping it in mind and come back to making a decision on it. Because when you look at the different policies, like this particular one, it's not too bad, it's just before the last paragraph. The next one, all of the CFs are at the bottom. But then when you get to 3515, we have half a page of cross references right in the middle, and several of those don't even reference the sentence before it, the introductory sentence. You know, they're kind of, so it just seems very awkward as you go through and. But it's just a formatting thing. It's not right or it's not wrong. It's just.
Miss Maple?
That one struck me as a little bit different though, because I read that one as those were stuck right there in the middle because it was a direct reference, like these are all the various reasons that the superintendent may order the closing or delay, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Then I would say there it's not a cross-reference as much as then if those are the things. But money in school buildings, I can't see closing the building for, I mean, you delay, I mean, you have a theft, you have a theft. You're not dealing with, anyway, I don't want to overdo it, but if those are the things, my opinion is just, it's a very awkward and breaks concentration as you go through the policy. So.
Well,
Miss Maple?
I don't disagree. That was why I thought that one was different, but I don't disagree.
I mean, maybe folks can ponder on that and we'll continue to move through the policy, and then, you know, as we reach a consensus, we can move in that direction. Okay.
Yeah, I'm comfortable with that.
Do you have anything more on that policy, Mr. Doran?
Not on that one.
Ms. Burnett?
I just am curious, just reading through it and then going back through our old policies and stuff. I understand it says the school district prohibits the possession, use, distribution, or sale of intoxicating alcohol and illicit drugs. That's really the only reference to the drug side of things. It's a lot on tobacco and alcohol, and I'm just curious on why we don't have more on the prohibition of the illicit drug side, or even with marijuana or something like that inside this policy.
By Dr. Minor.
Yeah, I believe that's specifically because it's calling out a drug-free campus, and there'll be more references to that when we get to the students article or chapter, and there'll be quite a bit more on drugs and other substances, but this is calling out specifically that drug-free campus. Is that correct, Diana?
Yes, and we, our existing policy was about tobacco. There was a statute around the tobacco. We copied ASDs in adding the alcohol and drug-free campus because that it did make sense. We liked that they had that example in there too, but that wasn't part of the AASB model or any of our existing policy.
We want to ensure that it was clear that it wasn't, our campuses were not only tobacco and alcohol free, that they were also drug free as well, other substances.
Ready to move to the next one? And are people needing reading time? Okay, I wasn't sure. I have something on this, but other people might too. In reading it, and it was more of a question for environmental safety, I was wondering if it should mention school shootings or those type of things. It talks about explosions and other stuff and hazardous things, but when we're talking about the school board believes students and employees have the right to learn and work in a safe environment, part of that is also, you know, that unfortunately our schools across our whole country aren't exactly the safest places. Not because we don't want them to be.
Is that captured anywhere else in policy or AR?
Yes, it is. This policy 3515 goes into safety and security more towards that direction. And then there's going to be more violence related policy in students and staff policy.
And I saw it a little lower, but since I thought this was like the overall safety, should we add in something in this broad part about like, do we mention any of that? Because it talks about precautionary measures against accidents, fires, explosions, and other physical hazards. But like I said, it was more of a question if it was worth putting in there or not. Mr. Burgess, then Mr. Doran, then Ms. Maple.
So to me, I think there's a distinction between environmental safety and security. So I think that to me, it's appropriate that they're in different policies, because an environmental hazard, this is what I do for a living, it means that that it's something that's just inherent about the environment that is potentially dangerous. So you think about, you know, chemicals in a chemistry class, or cleaning supplies being stored correctly, or, you know, a contaminated site running with contaminants underneath the school, you know, those kinds of things. That's to me what environmental safety means, is just the actual environment and the hazards that are naturally there, whereas something like an act of violence would be under security.
Mr. Doran?
I very much concur with that, and in 3515, there's a specific addressing weapons and firearms.
Ms. Maple?
Is 3513-3 the policy that is relied on for not allowing sale of alcohol when there are rentals of the building? Is this where that would land?
I think it's cross-reference, but I think there's another policy that's specific to building rentals that might say that clearly, that there's not alcohol allowed for events and building rentals.
Okay. I have questions about that specifically, but that probably doesn't belong in this editing of policy conversation. Or maybe it does, I don't know.
You're welcome to ask if you want to, Ms. Maple.
I have existing in the nonprofit world of folks renting other spaces, because none of us own spaces big enough. It comes up a lot of how that, like that if they rent out the, what's the, on
Airing?
campus, on UAF's campus theater, Davis, right? Concert
Davis.
hall, that like then they can, out in the lobby, they can sell alcohol, and how that sways them to rent space there because they can make money there which means that also sways them away from renting our facilities, which makes us money here. So it's just a conversation I've heard in the community, so.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot baked into what you're saying, and
Yes.
so I want to be clear that our building rentals do not make the school district money. In fact, in most instances, it costs us money to rent our buildings. That is something that I would recommend us looking at in the future, of looking at our scale of what we charge for building rentals. The board did look at that a couple of years ago and decided to keep them at a very low rate. But that's something that's misunderstood in the community, is that, we had somebody write the board an email recently asking that very question: why aren't you seeking this revenue option for providing gym space and, more readily available? Right now, we can't due to staffing issues with our custodial staff, but two, it also does cost us money to rent facilities because our rental fees aren't high enough to actually offset those costs.
That's fascinating. Thank you for that information.
Mr. Doran?
And just to confirm, as we continue to go forward, that we dropped or designee in throughout the policies, right?
I think last work session, we had a pretty robust conversation, and it sounded like we kept designee in most instances, although there were a few.
I withdrew it, then I thought we had decided otherwise.
Anything else in environmental safety? I'm fine with it staying as it was. It was just, as I was reading, I was like, I wonder if that should be there. Okay, so moving on to the next one, hazardous substances and pesticides. Is there anything there? Mr. Doran?
Might be more of a question. The fifth paragraph down, sure, our schools are regularly inspected. I'm assuming that we're staying in compliance with like fire inspections, sanitarian, those types of things. That's referencing, or is this something different?
No, I think that's what that's referencing.
And then in the last part of that sentence, shall inform the board of any environmental risks. What does it look like?
Did it. When we had asbestos possible at the North Pole Auditorium, and we were immediately told.
If the sanitarian goes through or the fire inspector goes through and says these things need to be addressed, most of the time they're pretty small, we take care of them, that's it, does it. But I haven't seen one since I've been on the board, and I'm not sure that the board got those before, so I'm just trying to figure out, I mean, a major thing which disrupted operation of the school. But in terms of regular practice, then just my question on that is that.
Yeah, maybe we need to designate or define risk in that sentence.
Significant?
Yeah, some kind of qualifier statement.
Yeah, and I'd be comfortable with that. And I didn't want to, I just wanted to raise the question, but that's my
I think
experience.
it's a good
is
question, yeah.
So we don't bog down the administration or the board with minutia.
Mhm.
Yeah, I agree, because, one of the things I mentioned earlier as a potential environmental hazard or risk is, cleaning chemicals that most people have in their households too, probably, But is that something that the board needs to hear about? Probably not. Is it an environmental risk? Could be interpreted that way. So I think, defining that a little bit better might be helpful.
Does changing it to significant environmental risk address those concerns?
Then how do you define
Is
significant?
it worth, what strikes me as the thing is really that's, interrupts building operation. And because I think that's the bigger deal, that either part of the building can't be used, or you might have to close it down or whatever, or delay it or something, or close it down. I favor doing building rather than school, because it might not be a school. Could happen here. Admin's gonna be closed because fire sprinklers are going off, or whatever. But maybe, so I'm just suggesting maybe that interrupts building operation.
So I'm gonna,
That more your bailiwick.
that's what I'm thinking, like I'm putting on my, and my, DEC hat here for a sec. So like, you know, when at work, you know, I work for the Contaminated Sites Program of DEC. So I really deal with environmental hazards a lot. And the way that we think about dealing with contaminated sites is it's a risk-based approach. You know, if there's not a risk to human health or the environment, if there's no exposure to a chemical that's out in the environment, sometimes the best thing is to leave it be. So just using that framework of the risk of exposure specifically, I'm thinking about, you know, like if there's, like I like the idea of risks or that might disrupt building operations, but what we're really getting at is there a true risk beyond the norm to students or staff, to users of the buildings? And so, you know, maybe, I don't know, I don't know how to change the wording to reflect that, but that's just kind of where I approach these issues, is like, yeah, is someone actually going to be exposed to the environmental hazard? Or is there a risk of that?
Mr. Doran.
Would it make sense, processing a little bit of what you're saying there, is putting a period after the potential sources of risk, ending it there, because those annual or those regular inspections should happen, period. But then the board shall be informed of significant environmental risks that may present a hazard to the health or safety of
Building users.
Staff or students, yeah.
And we were just discussing including all community members too, so it's anybody that could be accessing the building, but I'm trying to figure out where I was at with the wording. So the board shall be informed of any significant, did we keep the word significant? Of any environmental risks?
and I would
Risk
top
exposure.
out any, just put significant, but
Of any environmental exposure?
okay.
Risk of exposure.
I think significant is important. I think any is less important.
Oh, okay. Okay, the board shall be informed of.
So I think we can actually take out exposure if we highlight that it's about risk to staff or student. You know,
I think we want to do broader, some kind of like
So-
building occupants or
that's what I would actually use, yeah, building occupants or users.
Users.
Anything else on that one?
And not to nitpick, but can we make that active voice instead of the board shall be informed, the superintendent shall inform?
I'll continue messing with that.
Okay. So school safety and security, if there was nothing, I think just pesticides was left on that one. I had a overall general statement on that one, which is it seems the page 33, safety and security, to be a hodgepodge of things that could use cleaning up and breaking into separate policies. Yeah. She said she'd keep working on it.
Okay.
Like she was gonna do her magic.
Okay.
Ms. Burnett.
I don't disagree, but I was, my biggest concern was that second paragraph. Really, I just wanted something entered into it. So it says superintendent may order the closing, the delay in opening or early dismissal of any or all schools in order to protect the safety and welfare of the students and staff. Excuse me. I would like that to also reference sit tights, when like we had at North Pole, or we've had at multiple schools. I would like that specifically referenced, and I think that that would be very beneficial for us.
I have a question on that. I don't want to speak. Is a sit tight ordered by the superintendent or can a building administrator?
A building administrator can order a sit tight, but I think that they would be technically a designee.
So currently it only says the superintendent. If we're sticking with or designee, should we put that in there? I know we said it means the same thing, but
Also, can I just add on that point, and as we think and process this policy specifically, there is a whole section on crisis response planning in Article 6 that we're not to yet, so that's gonna go much more into Alice drills, sit tights, and all of those procedures.
I think I would still like that in this policy as well, though.
oh, good point. Do you want to say that for, sorry, it was a really good point.
I don't think that you can just add sit tight. I think it would have to be a separate sentence because otherwise then the designee would believe that they could close the school, delay the opening of the school, the early dismissal, and that's at the discretion of the superintendent, not the building principal. So I think it's a separate addition. I don't think it's just as simple as adding it into that sentence. I think that would cause confusion.
No, yeah, good point. That I would like that as a separate sentence, that the superintendent or designee may also order sit tight, or however we
Or
phrase that.
lockdown, there's,
Lockdown, yeah, lockdown of, so, yeah. I understand it's referenced in another place. I think it's also good here.
do we have it as a cross-reference in this too, that next one? Okay. Mr. Doran?
I see several crossovers, and because, when I think of sit tight, then I think of fire drills, and buildings are closed for entry, or, there's a variety of things that come up. And a sit tight also may be because they're doing a medical evacuation of a student and things like this. There's the issue of just that the superintendent can say, we're not going to have school today, bad weather. Or that a building may be closed because pipes burst and can't do it. The delay, the early dismissal pieces. That is operational. It's not just related, but the first sentence here is really brings it to the idea of violence and crime. And that's a whole different story than just closing, opening, early dismissal. I mean, there's, and which I think opens it up broader conversation. So I'm concerned in the cross-reference here, if this is specifically violence, crime, or are there other safety issues that they're closing it for environmental issues? I think we're mixing some things here. I think sit tight is very different. It's just like your fire drill and it's like your other types of things. Or not a drill if you have a fire evacuation or you have other evacuation of the building for some reason.
I think to Ms. Burnett's point, though, the one that was most recently used was because of violence and police presence. And so clarifying it within a policy talking about safety and security is saying it might also be used for that.
And maybe it's added at the end of the first paragraph so that it's strictly aligned with that. And maybe rather than designee being more clear, superintendent or building administrator may implement lockdown procedures. And end of the first paragraph after discipline.
If there's nothing else to bring back to the other point that I started with, we talk about this sit tight and all of those procedures. And then at the bottom, we talk about prohibition of weapons on school property. And they seem not to like flow directly together in the way it talks about it. And it also talks about vandalism and burglary. That word that my mouth can't currently say for whatever reason. So I don't know how we clarify. I just know when I was reading, I was like, why are all of these things together? They don't make sense together.
Can I add just one thing real quick? To that point, the last piece on prohibition of weapons on school property is one of our policies that we were trying to find a home. So that is partly why you feel that way.
With that being said, I concur. Why don't we make it a separate policy? And I think that deserves it because it also, people who are looking for the policy on weapons would want to find that quickly. And if it's a separate, I don't know whether it be 3515.1 or, but I think it's worth having it separate and does that parallel what we have? What our current policy says?
Yes, Mr. Dorn, it is its own policy.
I'm supportive of making it 3515.1. So I guess it just leaves that last bit that it doesn't make sense why the superintendent or designee shall establish procedures to secure physical records, district assets, and protect against vandalism during non-business hours. Why that's a part of this, or at least at the very bottom, if we're going to make it work, maybe moving it up so it just seems so out of place with what we're currently talking about.
I will just say it does align with kind of how our policies are built right now, and this is actually where we have all of our key procedures and building security procedures, so that AR was going to be attached here too, so it does align with kind of where we have our building security and safety policies.
Do we have any other oh, sorry, I missed Mr. Okay,
And we,
yeah.
I'm not exactly sure where we are.
I was just, to her question was what I was going, or what she just said about it needing to be in this thing, which makes sense. Do we have other policies on vandalism or records that it should become its own, or should we just move it up so it doesn't get lost at the bottom of a list of cross-references?
So with that, I would favor moving it up, but that's because I feel the CFs just kind of chop it up. And if they were at the end, makes more sense. To that point, in terms of the wording added in that first paragraph there, I would suggest superintendent or building administrator. I would say it should be singular rather than, but because the administrator is the one who needs to make the decision immediately if we're going into, they can't call downtown and ask. They're going to make that call. But there could be a situation, I'm thinking in the neighborhood or such, which could come to downtown, that the superintendent would call the building and say, lock down, there's police activity, to make sure that they have heard, something like that. So, and then I have one more question.
Go ahead, Mr. Rowan.
In the list of CFs, it references child abuse and neglect for closing, delay, or early dismissal. And I'm just not sure why that fits as a cross-reference in this.
It might be related to student safety in the first paragraph, potentially. Do you know, Diana? Because I think those cross-references relate to both of those paragraphs, not just the one, that singular sentence, I guess. But I could be wrong.
For the, for the child abuse and neglect, that's part of the long list of cross-references.
Mhm.
All of these cross-references were embedded in this policy by ASB, so this is how it's presented in ASB.
Maybe we can flag that one and then cross-reference AASB this week and see why it might be a part of the
This
cross-reference
policy.
for this policy. Yeah, that's what I had said, potentially student safety.
And I guess it depends upon what that 5141 actually says. You know, because I could see doing a lock, I mean, I've been there where you do a lockdown, maybe not the whole building, but classrooms, because of somebody who's an abusive parent may be coming and you're protecting the classroom or something of that sort. But I was trying to, that seemed out of,
policy, that policy speaks to mandatory reporting. So that, I think, fits.
okay. It just jumped out at me as being one of those odd, so, but that's okay. That's fine with it. I did have, well,
Anything on that one still, or?
if we decide we're going to separate out the prohibition on weapons, okay. I just had a question on number 3. I just made the notation, what about if it's a parent picking up their kid? who is a law enforcement, running through my mind, in most cases, they're effectively on official duty when they come in uniform. But I was just, other circumstances where a parent who might be picking up their kid, they're in uniform, but they're sort of in between. I may be making too fine a line, it's just a question that came up, and you may have a better current time of what's happening today than my reference.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a good question. I remember one instance that we ran into this, and I know for sure the troopers regulations basically require individuals that are in off-duty clothing to have their weapon concealed. And in this instance, the individual didn't. And so, they asked the parent to remove the firearm or, come back, essentially. But I mean, I think there's discretion there by the board to get at that language. If we wanted to make an exception for law enforcement that were not in their official capacity, but being on campus with a weapon.
Might be an AR, I don't, yeah.
What if they're in uniform? Like, I actually know of a parent, and like in the past few years, that does walk into in uniform carrying a gun, and I've never flagged it because they are in their official trooper uniform,
Yep.
picking up their child.
Yep, we've no issues with that.
And that would be covered in this, even though they're not in official capacity, like they're operating, getting their child. This is,
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're in uniform, that it feels like they're still in an official capacity, and actually the way that their order of priority in responding to events, because they are still in their uniform, they're required to respond immediately. So,
Yeah, I raise it not because I think it's a problem, but I just want to, and my experience has been, I mean, yeah, people come in, they have lunch with their kids, they have, picking up their kids, and they're effectively, in lots of ways, they're on call anytime. So I don't see it as a problem, but I just wanted to raise it to make sure.
yeah, maybe we can get at in our next law enforcement meeting, have some conversations around this. And I think if, the law enforcement officer had a badge clearly displayed, then that would make a difference too. I don't want to put our building administrators in a situation where, we have hundreds of kids in our building and not knowing, that a parent might or might not be a law enforcement officer. So, if we had some flexibility there, I think, we'd need to have some language that, a badge is clearly shown or worn on the officer. So, building administration knows who that individual potentially is.
We don't typically have undercover or people out of uniform. They maybe like some detectives and stuff like this in other venues. So but I just wanted to raise it, and it could go into the AR if it needs to be addressed. But I think that conversation, I'd be real comfortable with that.
Yeah, for sure.
oh, Mr. Burgess.
Yeah, and I was just reading through this again, and just the second paragraph under prohibition of weapons, it says the possession of a weapon or any object that can reasonably considered a weapon is, on school property is prohibited. There's a lot of objects that could reasonably be considered a weapon that do have business being in our schools. I mean, I'm thinking, a tire iron, crowbar, how do we define what can be reasonably considered a weapon?
I'm sure that there's a legal definition that we could dig into. I don't while lots of objects could be considered weapons, I don't think that a reasonable person would consider a tire iron a weapon first. And so I think the primary use of such object would be kind of the defining factor there. But we can,
And so, you know, I know that like pocket knives aren't allowed. They were when I was in elementary school, as long as they were short enough. But where is that defined that, you know, knives aren't specifically not allowed? Is that an AR or?
in the student chapter.
Because, you know, and because that's also one of those items that its primary use is not a weapon. It's a tool. If you cross the border to Canada, they ask you, you know, do you have any weapons? I always say, well, I have a pocket knife. And they say, get out of here. You know, but yeah. So I don't disagree that like considering its primary use should be the first consideration. But then there seems to be certain exceptions to that as well. So I don't know if it's, I don't know how other members feel about defining that better, but just wanted to flag that.
I mean, I think it's, so this is my opinion. I mean, I think it's good to have some flexibility there. And in most instances, the building administrator or the superintendent would be contacting law enforcement if they thought that there was a weapon involved in whatever kind of issue. And then, you know, law enforcement would determine whether or not that would be a weapon.
And then just one final point on this one. Do we need to carve out what is not a weapon? Or sorry, let me reframe, because that's not what I was actually trying to ask. If someone uses a mundane object that is not typically a weapon as a weapon, or threatens to use it as a weapon, do we have something to address that in policy or AR?
Certainly with students, we do for sure. And, you know, I think if it were an adult or some other, you know, visitor or something along those lines, then we would work through law enforcement processes rather than board policy to deal with that.
Okay, fair enough. Thank you.
Are we good to move on to intruders on campus? I'm thinking so. Did anybody have one for there? I do have one. Mr. Doran?
Go ahead and I'll.
Mine, so there was a lot of comments when I went through it. Could we list the AR on appropriate school behavior here as a crafts reference? The one that we just did.
Yes, it's visits to the schools and it's on the list.
Okay, that one is it.
Yes.
I wasn't sure if that was AR or policy, and that was why.
Good point. It's actually an exhibit, how it's going to be posted. So this doesn't say that it's cross-referencing to the exhibit, but it does get us to the policy. So if we want to be more specific about it, exactly it being the exhibit, I could add that.
If it's going to be a link, it's fine. My next thing was when I look at CF 1250, it's not what's listed in our new policy manual. And I figured it was because we hadn't updated stuff, but it was like, because we do have a 1250 in our policy manual, but it has nothing to do with this. Like policy 1250.
Let me double check that real quick.
I forget what it was if I go back out. It was like in no way related.
Well, I will say that now that we have chapters and articles in our policy manual, you're going to find 12s, and you're going to find things under chapter 12, and then you're going to find things under article 1. However, visits to the schools should be 1260 under article 1. So if you go to
Yeah, I think it is 1260, but on this policy
So
it
that
says
is-
1250.
yes, so that is incorrect, but not for the same reason.
Research in schools is what our policy 1250 is. I was like, that's not what she meant.
But if you look at Article 1, the new Article 1, and you look, yeah,
Yeah, if I go to article. No,
Oh,
I
you did
figured
find it,
I
okay.
was wrong, which is
Okay.
why I didn't say it at first. Now I see it. Well, that one says board policy 1250 is volunteer assistance.
Right, so thank you for
1260.
bringing it up because it is 1260, so that
Awesome.
number was wrong. Yes.
And Diana, can you, I don't think we have the exhibit in the policy manual.
Okay.
Can we flag that?
Mr. Doran, did you have something?
Yeah, the second paragraph. Let me talk through it a little bit. I've gone back and forth and whether it's kind of okay or it's too broad. I did make a notation in terms of looking at the AR or how we formulate the new AR. I do think that building administrator may expel might make more sense than shall promptly. But why I kind of went to the too broad is that what constitutes those things? In some cases, I can see, parent wanting to go into a classroom right in the middle of a lesson and pull the kid out without even coming to the office. I mean, those types of things. But I'm also thinking about the situation where a parent comes and the suspicion is that they are drunk. They're picking up their kid. Do you send the kid home with the parent or out with the parent or not? My experience has been in terms of talking with law enforcement until and unless they actually get behind the wheel of the car, they're fine. Parent could be under the influence, but they can pick up their kid. That's fine. If you think if it's an abusive situation, I mean, you can deal with that one. I mean, but it's not unusual, or I should say it's not usual. But it does happen where a parent comes and is under the influence, pick up their kid, they're getting into a cab or somebody else is driving. That's fine. You cannot keep, but that's often a tricky situation. And thinking whether this is, I guess whether it's an AR is what sort of training guidance is given to principals, especially newer principals, in terms of this. That's why I am concerned that this is pretty broad. Some of the instances are quite clear, circumstances. I can think of those, and I've dealt with those, but also the questionable ones.
Yeah, I mean, in looking at the title for the specific policy, I think it's pretty focused on intruders on campus. And the reason I believe that is because later on it says, it says intruders throughout the policy, but then it also says strangers. And so I don't think that we're specifically talking about folks that are known to the school community. But I think your suggestion on may is okay, or the building administrator has the authority to promptly expel, something along those lines. I get a little nervous about may because if, somebody's expelled and they come back and say, well, they had, I guess they didn't have to expel me, but if it says clearly that they have the authority to do so, I think that's good. And then I think it's also important to note that we do a fair amount of training with our principals and administrators on de-escalation techniques. So we're not looking to, expel people from our school premises. We're a community partner, but if they are going to have a substantial disruption to school operations or threaten health and safety of students or staff, then, that may warrant expulsion from school campus.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that perspective on it.
Ms. Burnett, then Mr. Burgess.
I would agree with that. I don't think we need to dive deep into trying to define it down so far. It is very clearly relating to intruders, and intruders can be anything. It can be a parent, but it's not a parent that just mistakenly forgets to sign in at the front. I don't agree with May. I'm not gonna fight shall, but I mean, if we were to replace it with has the authority to, that'd be okay with me.
Mr. Burgess?
Yeah, I support that language, has the authority to expel. And the other thing I'm thinking here is any individual they think might disrupt operations, et cetera, is think really the word that we want there, or should we say something more specific like has reason to believe? Because, yeah, it seems a little too broad.
So it is 8 PM. Are people wanting to stop here? Are we wanting to keep going? Not sure how people are feeling. We are going to have to come back to this chapter no matter what.
What do you think? No pressure.
Hearing 30 more minutes. So say we're going to be done by 8:30, or do people want to be done now?
I'm okay with 8:30.
Okay.
Okay. So are we ready to move on to the next one?
Yeah, I'm okay with the adjustments on here. It was just a question that I wanted to bring forward, and I'm good with it.
Now we're recovery for property loss or damage. Were there any for this one? It's pretty short. Mr. Doran?
Perhaps more of this is in our current AR. I don't mind the briefness of this policy, but I think there are some guidelines that are actually reflected in state statute as to what limits and how you can do that and stuff. So I don't know that it needs in policy, but it was a question that came to my mind in terms of the AR going to cover this.
Yes. Yeah, I think there would be an AR that would provide additional detail into what that looks like for seeking reimbursement for damages.
Mr.
Am I
Burgess?
correct? There's statute on that. I think there's guidelines.
Yeah, I think there is limitations in statute.
Ability for acts of minors, probably.
Does it need to be a shall here, or should we have a dollar amount or something? Because a theft of a pencil is different from a theft of a computer, is different from vandalism of a school building or breaking a window. Like a monetary value under which we don't need to seek reimbursement might be useful. Or we could put may so that there's some discretion in whether or not we really need to take that action.
I support may, especially when you consider like young kids might vandalize a table by carving into it. Are we going to come after their parents, or do we use it as a teachable moment and, correct things? Mr. Doran?
That's the genus of my question, but because I think there are real clear guidelines. If my memory is has been being tickled on this, that there are real guidelines on those, and as long as they're addressed in AR, so that because otherwise, or you really need to outline them a little bit more here. But I think that the statutes really address some of that, and it also what's the responsibilities for those parents versus student. Anyway, there's a lot of detail in that, and I think it's in the AR, those guidelines, and then if those change by statute, they can change without a change in policy.
Ms. Dillard?
I'm not aware of this statute, but our current AR is the 743, and that is what's attached to this policy. And it speaks to some dollar amounts, and it ties into the vandalism, fire, theft, damage report that goes through risk. But it says the principal or unit manager is responsible for reporting vandalism or theft in excess of $100 to the proper police authorities. They will also notify the assistant superintendent. So that piece is in there.
Okay, and that's in the AR.
That is our current AR, and there hasn't been any editing to that AR at this time.
And then the cross-reference statute goes into more detail about the top-level ceiling of what parents would be responsible for.
$15,000 unless there's an insurance policy.
So there's so maybe that AR reference would be, or that will be renumbered for this.
Correct, and attached to it in the new manual, correct.
We good to move to the next one? Okay.
Can I just give a little, because this is such a interesting policy. There is, and we've talked to ASB about this policy. So background, it does come from a policy that was created by Kenai, and it's been picked up by other districts. We looked, Juneau has it, Anchorage has it. It's not based on any state statute guidance. So this really is about district school board preference for what this policy is going to say.
Mr. Doran?
Overall, I like this, and I can put in my principal hat how I've addressed these and dealt with it. It seemed to be pretty consistent. But I would suggest that first bold sentence is better put at after the second paragraph. I really don't care whether it's bolded or not, but that's the opening sentence to the policy. That seems inappropriate. It starts on a very negative.
Doran, go ahead.
Towards the bottom of that page, parent, guardian, sex offenders, the first sentence, first paragraph, second line, except as provided above. And I wasn't sure what above is.
Maple?
I thought that was the voting and open meetings, and then in addition to what's directly below.
That's how I read it.
Could be more, it could. There's not a number there to reference, but. Except as provided for offenders who do not have children enrolled in the district and in the following instances, so that it's clear that it's referencing that specific, if it's unclear, that it could, that's my suggestion, if necessary.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, if that's what it's referring to, okay. My other thought had been that sex offenders who don't have children should be at the end of the policy after, closer to where we have, well, it should be at the end of the policy. But that was just an ordering.
Ms. Maple?
Because what sex offenders who do not have children enrolled in the district because they're like the bare minimum, the lowest access that there could be. I thought it being at the beginning made sense because then that will apply as we go down the list. Like that's the bare minimum, so it'll apply to everybody else. Or like that's the most extreme limitation, rather.
Have more, Mr. Dorn?
No, I do have more. Under the procedures for prior approval, that the sentence, these arrangements are approved by the superintendent or designee. I thought was an extraneous sentence. I mean, I think they should be done by the building administrator, you know, those things that's typically done there. I'm not sure why it would need to come back, and in this case, designee would imply that it's someone higher than the building administrator. But I think principals deal with those on a case-by-case situation. Am I correct, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think I agree with your sentiment. I mean, the building administrator most likely is going to confer with their assistant superintendent, but I think it's duplicative and we could probably strike that sentence.
I did have a question on the last sentence. The parent guardian only can transport their own, fine, no, leave it there. My question there that rose is, how does that translate for a neighbor who says, no, that's fine, my kids can go home with his or her kids, with that person? We often enough have that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that would put the district or the school in a precarious position based on the way that the policy is drafted. And so I think it's up to the board on how you want to determine this, because parents do have the authority to name other individuals to be transporters of their students or, you know, other educational rights. And so it does seem overly restrictive if a parent is willing to allow somebody else, you know, to act in that role.
Mr. Burgess?
I'm just wondering if how staff would even be able to enforce that, honestly. I mean, we can say that we can say the parent or guardian can only transport their own children, but how do we know that that's happening? I mean, unless the child is unless they're being escorted out in the parking lot. I think it's really hard for staff to keep track of who's getting into whose vehicle.
Yeah, I would agree. I think the only time is if, you know, we were allowing somebody else to check a different student out of school, and then those instances, that's where the school might know. But if it's just a general stop, drop, and go situation, then yeah, I don't think that we would likely know that situation.
Mr. Doran?
If we struck that sentence, if a person in this circumstance, a sex offender, kidnapper, was making arrangements ahead of time for picking even their own children up, I think it gives us latitude that the expectation is if they were picking somebody else, those arrangements are made ahead of time. I think that we do have elsewhere, and I don't know whether it's in policy or AR, I mean, that basically our practice anyway has been that if somebody else is picking up your child, they typically call the office or we've got something that they're the emergency contact, or, you know, something of that sort. I mean, I've held a number of kids over the years where, you know, somebody else, oh, I'm picking so-and-so up, and we haven't heard from the parent, and then when the parent coming and, well, my kid went, wait a minute, you know, so we've really pushed, and I think this is practice in the schools, is call if you're having somebody else, your neighbor pick up your kid or grandpa or whatever. So I think we're covered there in terms of giving that notification without having. I'm just wondering, if that was struck, what would that leave?
Yeah, I think it makes it much more clear to strike it. So I'm in support of that.
Is there anything else on that policy? So,
Yes. On page, well, I've got 38, was it the last page of that policy? I have a couple questions on student sex offenders, but just contractors, I thought should go up before student sex offenders. You know, I guess along the lines of we're talking about adults, contractors are adults, and then get to the students. So just reordering there. On student sex offenders, second paragraph, second line, except those identified as having a disability. My inclination is to say that should be struck, because in the next sentence is talked about alternative educational setting, which is part of SPED law, et cetera. But it's there's that it's the appropriate placement for a student sex offender. They are not exempt. They are not really accepted because of having a disability. You'd still have to deal with their status as a student, as a sex offender. But that conversation is appropriate placement and alternative education, if appropriate, which is covered under disability law. So this says to me that it's an exception. If you're a student and you're a sex offender and you have a disability, you don't have to deal with sex offender. You
well,
do.
later it qualifies. If a student is subject of this policy is a student with disability, they will be provided for educational services in compliance with federal and state law. And that goes back to, like, there's serious things. And when you're talking about a student with a disability, they also might never be judged to be mentally competent enough to know that what they're doing is a sex offense. And so it's a whole other ball of wax when you're talking about that and how you handle it.
Right, can I respond to that as a follow-up? And then, yes, and that's exactly my point. The later paragraph, I think, is very appropriate. If they're if they were not judged as a sex offender because they're not a sex offender. Whereas this talks specifically about a student sex offender and then accepts those. The disability piece is addressed, I think, appropriate later on and needs to be in compliance, and I've actually dealt with the situation.
I think if you take out the earlier clause and leave in the second or the last
Right,
paragraph,
and that's what I'm
that
saying.
makes sense.
Okay,
because
and that's what I'm suggesting.
clarifying
I wanna keep that-
disability matters.
Yeah, it was just that clause where it is, I thought should be, because it is addressed appropriately. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
You covered, I was on the same track there. So I support this change.
That's it on that policy.
On to page 41, use of school safety video surveillance monitoring.
Sorry, can I just, it's just a question. Under the student sex offenders piece, I remember last year at the West Valley Candidate Forum, there was a question about, students who had committed some sort of assault, sexual assault against other students and they're still going to the same school together. Is this an appropriate place to address that situation, or would it be more appropriate under student discipline or some other section?
Probably most appropriate under our Title IX regulations, and in a lot of instances, the school, well, in all instances, the school district has to follow Title IX regulations. And so, depending on the situation, that oftentimes continues to occur where students do stay on the same campus, but oftentimes there's no contact orders or there's remedies in place so that students aren't in the same classes or in the same lunches. But all students in the instance still have a right to a free and appropriate public education. And so, I think most of that is guided through Title IX when you're talking specifically about sexual assaults.
Title IX, on that same, because I remember that also outlined that the victim's schedule is not the one that's supposed to be disrupted, that it should be the other person who is found to have perpetrated the incident.
Actually, based on the regulations that are currently in place in Alaska, it doesn't necessarily specify that it's the victim or the complainant, that both have equal rights and waiting under Title IX until it continues to go through the entire Title IX process. So if it went through the entire Title IX process and there truly was a victim, then yes, that would be weighted differently. But that oftentimes takes a long time to get there.
Mr. Doran?
If I could just share, unfortunately, I dealt with, as a high school principal, I dealt with this type of situation. This wording, keeping in mind that there are other issues and other things to be followed, but this wording would have covered me at that time, and options to look at, and alternatives and considerations, the other factors that are in here. It's broad enough to give, I think, the administrator the handle to work with, and then plan for managing that situation. Also having to bring in Title IX keeps changing and so keeping up to date on that, but still with that, and there are other legal things to be considered depending upon how that's adjudicated by the courts. So, but as an administrator dealing with it, I'm comfortable with both the guidance and the flexibility within this.
For sure. And I mean, I think in this policy specifically, because we're talking about sex offenders, to me, that means that it has gone through the full legal process and that the student's been convicted of a sexual assault of some sort. And at that point in time, that definitely gives the administrator leeway to provide proper remedies for the situation.
Following up on that, what if there's a situation where the courts cannot determine that someone committed an offense to the extent that they would be a sex offender under, the juvenile justice system or whatever? But from a district standpoint, district disciplinary actions, you know, it does seem like that happened. Because those are slightly different things, right? I mean, I'm not, you know, there's overlap, but so if someone is not, you know, a sex offender in the eyes of the law, but they seem to have committed some sort of offense related to sexual assault or harassment, is there policy that can address that? Is that under the discipline policy?
Yeah, that's where Title IX would kick in. That's exactly it. So Title IX would and could provide remedies even if the legal system does not, you know, convict somebody or find somebody guilty of such a crime. The threshold for a Title IX finding is lesser than that of the official court system.
I need a Title IX course, I think.
It's super complex.
And am I correct, we also have, it should be under the student section, we have a section about like harassment and those types of things.
Currently, it all reverts to Title IX. So historically, yes, but now all of that is covered under Title IX, and the Title IX officer works through all of those instances, and then at the end of you know, the conclusion or the findings, then they'll work with the building administrator if any discipline is necessary or schedule changes or whatever kind of remedies might be warranted in such instances.
This is a little unrelated, but is it safe to assume that staff get Title IX training?
It is safe to assume, yes.
And is it possible that board members could sit in on something like that?
It is a mandatory training for our staff. It's available on our mandatory training website, which I can send the link through CARM to the board, and it's a video that you are more than welcome to watch. It's out there on our website.
And then we do more extensive training with principals, and so I'll try to keep that in the back of my mind as we do the next big training. And if you're interested in that topic, I can invite you, and you can certainly learn more about it. And I think the important thing to realize is Title IX regulations have changed quite a bit, and right now we're kind of in this interesting period because in Alaska we have a stay of sorts of being under the past administration's regulations because the state's in a legal process to determine whether or not we should implement the new regulations, which are different from some of the things I've stated in terms of rights of complainant versus victims and those types of things. So
The EEO website on the district has a lot of really good Title IX guidance and information also. And the complaint process and everything is on there too.
Because we'll have new board members, I don't want to get too far away, but isn't that one of the trainings the new board members does? I believed when I came on, that was one of when you do child abuse, you do different ones. I've done it for other things just last week. Within the last 2 weeks, I did Title IX for other reasons. But I believe that was, I don't know what they're
So,
doing now.
The four of us received no training when we joined the board.
Okay.
We're working on that. Yep. We can add it. It's actually pulled up on our board onboarding process. I can make a note.
When I got
about
on
Title
board, I had to go through the same thing that the teachers did. Even though I've, but I was a new board member. I wasn't an employee anymore. So, okay, that's interesting. Good.
It's one of our goals that we established in our board self-reflective process that we did with Timmy was onboarding and doing better. So I've added that to our list there. It is now 8:33, so respecting everybody's time, we're not going to get through the rest of it at this pace. I would say we probably we'll need another session where we can pick up here, and also we know Mr. DeGraw is, necessary for the beginning of it. Yes. Mr. Minor.
And if you did have a lot of notes on policies that we didn't get to, and you'd be comfortable sending those to Diana, we could make some of those highlights or changes prior to the next work session, if you'd like us to do so.
Especially if they're like wording or editing, that is really helpful. And if you have, like, I had 2 questions left in the rest of that document. One was like, for transportation, should we change it from charter schools to schools of choice? Since that's how we're applying that busing transportation policy, is to all schools of choice instead of just charter. And then the other one was district records seems out of place at the very end. Maybe we need to move that ahead of the food service stuff. Mr. Doran.
Just for process, I've got notations on most all of them, but my concern is if we send them in, they get made, we don't know what's been made.
So how that was? Yep.
And so that's one concern. The other is, and it may just be me being a nerd, but I like the conversation. Like, I mean, this particular one is, I mean, that's a conversation which we usually don't get to have as a board and stuff, but there are several conversations around there.
Ms. Burnett, and then,
Could we color code maybe the entries?
and that's what Ms. Dillard had done previously in one of them. Like
I
Ms.
know,
Dillard just-
so sometimes, and I don't know what the problem is, but sometimes when you do highlight things or make them red, it does not come through in our packets in our email. I have had that happen to me before where it was all supposed to be in there in red or whatever, and it was not. It was italic, but you had to look real hard because of how the print was, that you really couldn't tell the difference between the italic and the regular, and so it was complicated to see the edits.
Yep. There was also, at one point, you had like split screened and you had, this is what was in the packet and this was what Mr. Burgess said. And so then it was just pretty clear what people were proposing. Ms. Maple.
That is what my expectation would be. Would not be that it would just be a new thing presented with all of the changes made, but a new thing presented, and then that Ms. Dillard could go through it and say, and here's something that we changed, and we all have in front of us what it was from. I certainly wouldn't want the changes to just be made and just be presented as if we should just approve them without discussion.
That's why I'm concerned.
That is not my desire. But I do like the idea of being able to go ahead and draft that ahead of, so that we're not doing the drafting piece in the meeting, but we're doing the discussion part in the meeting.
And I agree. I think I actually think it worked well last time and was a time saver. And then, we do have the ability to continue the drafting as we have the discussion too, and alter words. But I think it gives everybody kind of a heads up of what to expect, and that's helpful.
And especially if it's a typo or a grammatical error, like I think all of those were pretty comfortable with saying, hey, you caught that, let's fix it. I don't think it needs the full board to be like, yes, we should add the extra letter there. Like we should spell things appropriately. And so those are just helpful and save just a few minutes, but when we're going through hundreds of policies, it adds up. Anything else for the good of the order? Then I'd say we are adjourned.